Magnus Carlsen just won yet another titled Tuesday, and he did so in amazing fashion, in large part thanks to winning this game in this dead drawn position. He's playing against a 3100 rated super grandmaster, and he takes this position and turns it on its head. He also plays Jeffrey Zhang and Hikaru Nakamura. So these are games you don't want to miss. Let's see how he won this week's tournament. So we're going to start with this game against Dmitry Andreikin. He's playing with the white pieces here. Magnus Carlsen is, and this in-game is indeed drawish, very drawish, because you've got just one set of minor pieces, one set of rooks, and two pawns on the same side. And the game started off with a very interesting strategic decision. If it was white to play, which move is better? Should you play pawn to g4 or pawn to h4? One of these two moves is the way to push for a win. The other is to try and guarantee a draw. Well, I can tell you the correct move, and it is what Magnus played, h4. Putting the pawns on the same color as the bishop. And this is something you might think is the wrong decision, because that makes these pawns targets, right? Yes. But when the pawns are on the same color as the bishop, they also have a much more easy time of pushing themselves forward. So in general, if pawns are mobile, they have a better chance of creating problems for the opponent. So by putting the pawns on the dark squares, it's a riskier decision, but it's one that sets the tone for the rest of the game. Shows that Magnus Carlsen might be wanting to push this game further. The game continued with the move king to g7, and after king to f3, rook to f5 check, king back to g2, rook back to d5. Black, of course, perfectly happy with a draw. And here Magnus brings his own rook over to the f-file, cutting off the black king from entering into the game. Then Dmitry played pawn to h5, a very natural move. Again, remember, pawns that can move are more dangerous. So now it's a little bit harder to push this pawn forward. Of course, it is still much easier than if the pawn had been here on g4 and the pawn on h3. So, what does Magnus Carlsen do here? He plays the move knight to d8. A couple of ideas. One is what he played in the game. The other might just be knight to e6 and trying to reroute the knight closer to the king side. But what was the idea played in the game? Well, I can tell you it's after rook to d2 check, king to h3, rook to e2, preventing the knight e6 idea. Magnus played rook to f7 check, and after king to g8, he found the lovely rook f6. And the point is fairly straightforward. After the move bishop to e7, forking the rook and the knight, how can Magnus Carlsen both win material and avoid, well, losing his knight or his rook? So the correct answer here, no surprise, rook captures g6. And after king goes to h7, the only way to save both his rook and his knight is with the move rook e6. And so here, black trades, and this position is still completely dead drawn. This should never, ever be a win for white. Yes, sure, Mr. Andreikin is down a pawn, but that shouldn't mean anything in most situations. For instance, just to show you how this game can be drawn super quickly, if bishop to f6, pawn g4, the game now immediately ends. After pawn takes g4 check, king takes g4, and then bishop takes h4, and this is an insufficient mating material position. So the game can end very quickly, even up a pawn, because of this bishop sacrifice issue. But Magnus Carlsen wasn't done pushing, and he found an absolutely extraordinary plan. After king g6, he played the natural knight f4, and after king h6, king g2, and king to f3. Now, of course, Andreikin is never going to take this knight. This would be losing, thanks to lots of ways to win, but probably the simplest and the one I would do is just take with the pawn. And now this would normally be a drawn king and pawn in game with the h-pawns missing. But after something like king e5, king e7, pawn f6, king f6, Here, the way to win this would be to play king up to g6, and after king to g8, we go king takes h5, and now we have 2 pawns, and this is enough to win. Just to show you the simplest line, we can do this. And of course, without the h-pawns, this would be stalemate, but here we can go simply h5 and promote. So, back to the game. Black played bishop to b8, and Magnus had a incredible idea. Understand, he's doing this in mere seconds. He's got 6 seconds on his clock at this point. He goes king e4, and after bishop c7, king f5, bishop b8, and now he played king to f6, bishop c7, and at this moment, white plays a simply amazing move. Can you find, well, okay, the move is not amazing, but the idea behind it wins on the spot, unless black plays really great defense. Can you find what Magnus Carlsen played? So Magnus plays knight e2. He is preparing to reroute the knight, but this is a very hard maneuver to spot. Knight e2 is not so hard because obviously you're defending the pawn, but after the bishop went back to b8, Magnus is suddenly winning. The question is how? Because if you move the knight, then you just lose this pawn and then this pawn, and that is a draw. If you move the king, the bishop will simply go back, and I guess your only other option would be knight back to f4, in which case the position would repeat. And yet this position is completely winning. In what possible way? Can you find white's this brilliant move right here? This is the one move that is very hard to spot with only 6 seconds on your clock. I've already given you more time than Magnus had in the entire endgame. Here, knight d4. And it was at this moment that Dmitry Andreykin realized he'd messed up. Because the point is, if bishop takes on g3, knight to f5, and this is a winning endgame. It's very important to note that even though we have rook pawns left, this is, in fact, a winning endgame. Let me just show you. This is always winning in every circumstance. Let's not stalemate him, but let's play instead maybe something like here, king up, here, and here. Don't push that pawn just yet. We have a checkmate. So the knight in games with rook pawns are always winning, no matter which side it is. A knight can always promote any pawn on the board with the help of the king. So that's why we see that Mr. Andreykin plays the move bishop c7, still waiting. Now, knight f5, and beautifully here, the knight both defends the pawn and attacks the king. This is the only square on the board where he's able to play both defense and offense. And this really shows you why knights dominate bishops on one half of the board. The knight is able, from a light square, to attack 2 dark squares and is just running laps around this bishop. The king, of course, has to go to h7, and this now means that white can slide his king into g5. And with this move, now finally white's going to win a second pawn, and this is, in fact, always winning in every situation. Here, Mr. Andreykin resigns the game because he realizes that there is no hope. Just to illustrate, probably the simplest way to win is to just go with g4, and after bishop to b2, h5, maybe bishop to a1, just kind of waiting on this diagonal because it seems like it's the best one. Maybe just play h6, bishop to b2. There's nothing better to do if the king is forced to move, like let's say with knight to e7, king to f8, then he has to do what he has to do. And then let's just say knight to d5. Maybe the idea is to come over here and block the bishop and prevent the king from getting to the corner. So the threat would be h7, so the king would have to come back to g8. Then we could go knight to f6 check. And after the king goes to h8, we can play g5 here. And the bishop is forced to move. And don't go pawn to h7. Instead, king f7 is the g pawn that's going to win the game for us. Bishop back to b2, g6, And, well, you can now go into this endgame and see that it is losing. So, a wonderful and brilliant endgame from Magnus Carlsen, something that we haven't, have we seen a lot of recently? Magnus Carlsen was known as the endgame king for quite some time. And he's just showing again why he really still is the best player to ever play the endgame of chess. So wonderful game, and again, he did this in just a few seconds. He had about a 1 second increment, and so he was making pretty much every move in 1 second. So now let's take a look at just a couple of short games. He winning this game set himself above the pack, and nobody was really that close behind him. The guy who came in second place, the only player half a point behind him going into the final round, was Jeffrey Zhang. And Jeffrey, of course, had to play for a win if he wanted a chance to win the tournament. Magnus only needs a draw to win at this point. So Magnus is playing white yet again, and he played the move pawn to b3, asking black, what are you going to do? Black just played a quiet move pawn to c6, but all of a sudden, things get a little dicey. And that is because white found the incredibly strong move pawn to f4. And the reason this is so instructive is because you need to understand how to win this sort of endgame. This is a queen, rook, and bishop endgame, but it's something else. It's a bishops of opposite color endgame. Yeah, there's queens and rooks on the board, but primarily it's a bishops of opposite color endgame. That means two things. One, if the trades happen, like the queens are traded and the rooks are traded, you can't really trade the bishops. If the queens are traded and the rooks are traded, the game will be a absolutely easy draw. However, if you can manage to keep the queens on the board, bishops of opposite color are known as incredibly dangerous positions. They are really great at creating attacks. So Magnus Carlsen plays the move f4, expertly opening up the black king position, sacrificing a pawn while doing so that he can manage to create some attacking chances. The black player Jeffrey played bishop takes g4. Had you just captured this pawn, you would have been up a pawn. After, say, queen f3, bishop takes here. But this is, of course, completely losing because of rook takes c8. So you cannot actually keep that extra pawn. So that's why Jeffrey simply played bishop takes pawn right away. After the trade of rooks, he lost his pawn back on g5. After the queen came in, threatening, well, not really threatening much, just well placed on e5. There's no rush to win this pawn back, but he is going to win the pawn back. And Magnus Carlsen has just a really solid position. Is it going to be enough to win? It's very hard to say. Magnus Carlsen is the best at endgames ever, but there's one big problem now, and that's there's so little material left on the board that all Jeffrey needs to do is trade queens, and it's all over because there's only bishops of opposite color left. So that's exactly what Jeffrey tried to do, saving this tough position with the moves king g6, bishop h4, and queen f5, very expertly bringing his queen into the defense of the king. Queen g7, that's not mate. The king has h5, and with only 11 seconds left in this position after the move bishop to e1, Jeffrey found queen g5, which forks the king and queen, and you should already know what that means. And it also actually threatens this pawn, which is kind of important. So technically, we're going to take this pawn, if anything. What that means is once the queens are traded, there is now no more chance for either player to win this game. Bishops opposite color are simply too drawish. The bishop goes to d2 to defend the h6 pawn, and after king to f5, the players played a few more moves before eventually ending in a draw, securing Magnus Carlsen's next titled Tuesday win. Now, while this might have been a bit anticlimactic for those of you looking for a little bit of chaos at the end of the tournament, there was something even more anticlimactic, and that would have been what should have been the blockbuster match of the day. Hikaru Nakamura versus Magnus Carlsen. Hikaru with the white pieces here, taking on Magnus. And the only reason I'm showing this game is because it is it's something that happens quite a bit this game, and I want you to be aware of it if you are not already. So the game ends in just 14 moves in a threefold repetition, and that is because of a very famous opening where white starts off with the Ruy Lopez, bishop to b5, and then we go into an open Ruy Lopez with knight takes e4, pawn to d4, and then knight back to d6, and now pawn takes on e5. If you want to try and keep the pressure, you can play bishop to a4. But a lot of times if we see d takes e5, what's going to happen after this bishop sacrifice, it's a bishop sacrifice, but not really, because the knight's actually trapped here on a5. You can't go back to d6, and you can't go back to d4 because that's covered twice. We see knight to d4. By the way, if you're wondering why not go knight d4, takes, and now you're up a pawn, this is very, very dangerous for black, and that's because white doesn't even need to play the move pawn takes knight. They can interpose with this move bishop g5. And now, if you block with the bishop, we're going to play e takes d6. And then we're going to play d takes c7. And we are going to be equal with material, but black's king is in a lot of trouble. His pawn structure is kind of a mess. This is just not really anything that you want to be a part of. So that's why always in this position we see knight to d4. And after knight takes d4, we see pawn d5. Trying to gain space in the center, trying to match white's very strong pawn on e5. Here we see the secret ninja pawn move, pawn takes d6. And after knight takes d4, queen takes d4, and queen takes d6, we now reach this position. And in this theoretical position, again, it's been played hundreds of times. White typically goes queen to e4 check, and after queen to e6, white is ahead in development by a little bit, but he's got a safer king, so he doesn't want to trade queen, so he goes over to d4. But then black, who is a little behind in development and has a slightly less safe king, goes queen d6, offering another trade. And of course, white doesn't want the trade, so white checks, and black wants to trade, so black blocks, and then white comes back over here, avoiding the trade, and now the queen comes to d6, and that is threefold repetition, and the game was immediately over. So kind of a little sad, but definitely an opening that you should be familiar with. If you ever see the Ruy Lopez go into the open version, pawn d4, and then you see this move, pawn takes pawn, you might be witnessing a very short game. After the knight takes again, the knight's trapped, so you win the knight back, and then all that needs to be done is a couple central trades, and the queens go back and forth for the draw. So congratulations to Magnus Carlsen winning the title Tuesday this week, and doing so by winning with a score of 9.5 points, clear first place. So great job, Magnus, and I can't wait to see you in the next title Tuesday. Bye, guys!